Vice President Ford, President Nixon said in his State of the Union address that 1 year of Watergate was enough, that we ought to quit talking and thinking about it. But with all the questions still unanswered before the courts and before the Congress, can we quit? Is 1 year really enough?
I think the President was speaking figuratively, not literally, because he recognizes, as all of us do, that there are some court cases that do involve Watergate. There are some actions still in the Senate as well as in the House that have bearing on Watergate and ramifications involved in it. But I do think the President was saying that because he wanted to concentrate in the State of the Union, the main emphasis being on the problems we have and the problems we have to solve. So he was using that phrase, I honestly believe, in a figurative, not a literal sense. He recognized that certain things still had to be wrapped up in the House Committee on Judiciary and hopefully in the Senate Committee under Senator Ervin, as well as the court cases which will, in due process, take their time.
From CBS News, Washington. A spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview on Face the Nation with the Vice President of the United States, Gerald Ford. The Vice President will be questioned by CBS News correspondent Phil Jones, David S. Broder of the Washington Post, and CBS News correspondent George Herman. Face the Nation is produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guest and panel.
Mr. Vice President, Senator Mansfield said in his reply to the State of the Union address that he thought that the question of impeachment of the President would be finished in this session of the Congress. You said in your Atlantic City speech that you thought some people would try to draw it out endlessly. Which do you think is going to happen now?
The best evidence I have, Mr. Herman, is that the House Committee on the Judiciary will probably act one way or another sometime in the month of April. I don't like to set a firm deadline because a legislative body doesn't operate quite that way, and no committee does either, but it appears that every intention, and I assume in good faith and believe in good faith, is that the House Committee will act sometime in April, and one way or another, either to approve or disapprove whatever they bring forth, will have House action sometime shortly thereafter.
As you know, the Judiciary Committee is going to the full House this week to ask for very broad subpoena powers that are apparently broad enough to enable them to call the President himself as a witness should that need arise. Do you see any objection to their having this power?
I think the power should be granted. I would have some reservation about whether that power is sufficient to mandatorily bring the President to testify before the committee. I think there has to be some definition of just the extent of that power, either in the debate on the floor of the House or subsequently in the courts if the matter does arise.
Would you recommend to the President that he voluntarily go before the Congress on this?
I think it depends on the circumstances, and it's premature to make any judgment at this point. I understand that the President, in that subpoena that's been issued out in California, that the decision made by the Attorney General is that he should not appear. But there are some rumors to the effect that he might answer interrogatories that would be sent to him. This may be the format. I'm not saying it will, but it might be the format for any appearance before the House Committee on the Judiciary.
Just let me take you back to the question I was asking you about your speech in Atlantic City. You said then a few extreme partisans seemed determined or bent on stretching out the ordeal of Watergate for their own purposes, whatever they might be. And what I'm trying to find out is, have they changed, or were you wrong, or have the partisans, those extreme partisans, lost their fight to stretch it out?
I think it's too early to tell.
I just was picking up your suggestion that it would be done in April.
Well, there are those, I think, who would like to have it drawn out, and I read in one of the papers here this morning that There are some who really are trying to force action on the president, but who would rather have no definitive action taken by the date that I indicated a few minutes ago. They think it might be more politically advantageous to them.
But you're closer to it than the papers. I'm trying to find out what you feel about the House committee and the House itself.
I'm not as close to the people that I was referring to as I am to others, so I get my information secondhand from them, that they see some political benefit in dragging it out and not forcing a vote. But I think from the point of view of what's good for the country, forget these partisans. It's far better to have a resolution of the matter sometime in April or shortly thereafter.
Mr. Vice President, you talk with the President daily. Does he really want the impeachment process to go forward and have a vote on this? Does he tell you this?
He certainly wants the committee to get to the business of undertaking their investigation. I'm sure he doesn't want any affirmative resolution out of the committee. In the first place, he doesn't think there are any facts that would justify it. But I do think that he wants the committee to make up its mind whether it's going to act or not. And he feels so strongly that we've got more important things to do than to get into this kind of a matter that he says, get them going. Let them make up their mind. So we don't interfere with the other legislative priorities, which are extremely important.
Well, the best way to move this along, of course, would be if he produces the information that the committee is going to be asking for very promptly. As you know, many members of Congress thought that the President put a big fat loophole into his pledge of cooperation the other evening when he said he would cooperate as far as the responsibilities of his office allowed. What did that mean?
I think what he was saying was the committee had no right to go on a fishing expedition. The administration has supplied more tapes to the special prosecutor than the special prosecutor asked for. The administration has supplied more documents to the special prosecutor than the prosecutor asked for. The administration, or the president, has tried to cooperate with the special prosecutor. I think he will cooperate within a reasonable definition of what is needed for the particular job that that committee has. But for them just to have an open-ended subpoena and let them go on a fishing expedition through all of the files of the White House or any of the executive branches, I think is unreasonable.
But you have heard the objection, I'm sure, that people raise that there is nothing in American jurisprudence that allows the person under investigation, or the suspect, if you will, to tell those investigating him or prosecuting him what is or is not relevant to their inquiry.
But there is no legal backup either for an unlimited fishing expedition in the office of the president. I think you have to differentiate between the office of the president, where there is no legal precedent for a fishing expedition, and the rights of any individual among our 211 million people. It's the office of the presidency, on the one hand, that I think has to have some reasonable protection.
I just wanted to see if I understood you correctly. You seem to be saying that, or at least the only point that you mentioned was fishing expedition. You did not raise the question of whether, in a specific demand for a specific document or documents or tape or tapes, the president would have the right to refuse, let's say, because of national security or some other reason. Is that what you were saying, that he does not have this other right, that he only has the right to object to fishing expeditions?
I think there would have to be a logical explanation for the seeking of any individual document.
Right.
Otherwise, you're going on a fishing expedition. Now, there may be a difference of opinion as to whether or not a particular document or particular tape had relevance to impeachment, because the specifics of impeachment in the Constitution are very, very definitive. Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. So whatever they want has to have a very direct relevance, in my judgment, to the specific definition of impeachment in the Constitution.
Mr. Vice President, aren't we really getting hung up on technicalities here? The White House, through Senator Scott and through you, is saying that it has evidence, information that will totally exonerate the president, that will show that John Dean is a liar. But yet this information isn't coming out. The court, Judge Sirica, has said if the White House has any information, it's free to disclose it. There is nothing there that should stop the White House from doing it. The question is, why isn't it? What is more overriding than getting all this information out now?
Well, I do believe myself that it would be advantageous to get out the tape or the transcript or whatever the document is that has convinced Senator Scott beyond any doubt that the president is right and Mr. Dean is wrong. I would hope that would be made available as quickly as possible, and I've indicated that.
This is the document that was offered to you and that you did not have time to and have since decided not to see?
That is correct, and I think there's a very valid reason for that. Supposing I looked at it, and supposing I was of a nature that I wanted to help myself get a higher position, I could interpret that information to my own personal good and to harm the president. I don't think I should be in that position. I think it would be a very bad position for me, being number two, to misinterpret some information that might make it difficult for the president and more beneficial to me.
But on the other hand, if you're going to go out and say that the president is innocent of all these, don't you have a responsibility to the public to be informed on what that evidence is before you speak out and say, get off his back?
I have relied on two men, three men really, whose judgment, whose honesty, integrity I hold very, very high. Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania has seen it, read it. He not only believes the president is innocent, but he has repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. Well, the president himself says that evidence does prove beyond any doubt my innocence and Mr. Dean's wrongdoing. And others in the White House staff have also reiterated that.
I just wanted to be fair to Senator Scott and say his latest quote on the subject that I have read, at least, is that I will not be made a patsy by anyone on this particular document.
Yes, but he hasn't backed off on what he has seen as being a verification of his statement that the president is right and Mr. Dean is wrong.
As a lawyer, would you regard that as competent evidence, a document prepared as a summary by the White House?
It is done in legal proceedings. It is done and is used as evidence, and because you can always go back to the original evidence and have it verified if the court orders.
But that's the point that Mr. Jones raised. Since we know that the original evidence exists, why is there all this footseeing about a purported summary?
I wish that it would be made available as promptly as possible.
Well, why isn't it?
The White House feels that because of the attitude of the special prosecutor and to some extent the attitude of the court, that it should not be.
Is this the president who feels this way or his advisors?
I can't tell you whether it's one or the other or both.
I just want to go back one more time, if I may, to the question of if the president is asked for documents or evidence by the impeachment committee of the House. You mentioned the question of no fishing expedition. Then when I asked you, could he withhold a specific, presumably pertinent document, you brought up the question of defining ahead of time what the grounds of impeachment are. And of course, it's sort of mandatory that I throw back at you at this point your definition of impeachment some years ago when you said it's anything that a majority of the House decides at the time impeachment is. Now, how are we going to resolve that? What I'm really trying to find out is whether you think the president has the right to withhold a specific tape or document which has been mentioned in all the Watergate testimony and is therefore apparently legally relevant. Can he withhold that on the grounds of, say, national security or executive privilege?
I think you have to go back to what the grounds for impeachment are under the Constitution. It's a totally different...
I'll take Jerry Ford's definition.
Well, now you have to be very careful there, George, because I was referring to impeachment of a federal judge, and the grounds for impeachment of a federal judge are much broader, much looser than for the grounds of impeachment of a president. A federal judge is appointed during good behavior for an indefinite term during his good behavior. a president is elected for 4 years, and the people can get rid of him at the end of 4 years. But in the interim, the Constitution says the only way that you can get rid of a president is by impeachment under very definitive terms: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Our forefathers were very skillful. A man who's appointed for life during good behavior, those grounds are much broader. But a president who's only elected for 4 years, those terms for impeachment are much narrower.
I'm drowning. What I'm trying to find out is if the House asks for a document on the testimony or the memos back and forth between John Dean and the president, can the president, do you think, withhold it on grounds of executive privilege or some other grounds?
I think the tapes or documents have to be relevant to the definition of impeachment in the Constitution.
Mr. Vice President, one other question related to impeachment proceedings. Your successor as the House Republican leader, John Rhodes, has said that any member of the Judiciary Committee who has expressed himself as favoring impeachment ought to automatically disqualify himself from voting on the issue. Is that your view also?
I would take a broader view than that. I think that in the long run, most members will look at the evidence before they make up their mind. And the handful who have already made up their mind and publicly stated aren't going to have a significant impact, and I wouldn't disqualify them.
Mr. Vice President, one other question here. The 25th Amendment makes it possible for the president to name his vice president as acting president if he is incapacitated. If the Judiciary Committee votes out impeachment, and this process is going, headed towards the Senate, do you feel that the president should step down and name you acting president during this period?
I don't think so. I don't believe that a president should remove himself from office until he's convicted, which would be the trial in the Senate. I don't think it's ever going to get that far, but even speculating, I don't think a president ought to remove himself from office until he has actually been convicted by the United States Senate.
Mr. Ford, as Vice President, do you have any trouble getting gasoline?
No, my wife and children do, just like everybody else, but the Secret Service seems to have found an adequate supply for me and I guess President.
Do you think we ought to have gasoline rationing to avoid this long standing in line that presumably your wife and children have to go through?
I don't think so. I really have thought about this for a great deal, because I remember back in World War II when we had gas rationing. We had all kind of crime. We had black marketing. We had a terrible fouled up situation from beginning to end, even when we were fighting a world war. And it seems to me in the present atmosphere that it would even be worse. You'd have the worst aspects of rationing. Now, we're in a critical period at the present time because the government decided that to keep people warm and to save jobs, we had to put more of the crude into fuel oil, and that the assumption was that people would get along with less gasoline. There have been some dislocations in a geographical area. We've had a great effort by the American people to save fuel oil, thank goodness. We've had a light winter, and we've had some additional imports that came from various sources. Now I think we can gamble and probably reallocate more to gasoline and less to fuel oil, and therefore avoid the need and necessity of rationing.
Will the gasoline shortage, do you think, affect the campaigning of congressmen who have to tour around their districts, or should all candidates and from either incumbents or challengers be given unlimited gas to campaign?
It seems to me that they ought to get the same consideration and treatment that everybody else does.
Do you favor a rollback in the crude oil prices?
I think you can have some rollback in domestic prices. I think the price today is around $10 a barrel. I've heard some discussions in the White House between Senator Jackson and Bill Simon, and there seems to be some agreement between the two of them that there ought to be some rollback. But that's domestic. But you don't want to roll it back too far, or you're going to eliminate the stripper well people who have to get a certain price if they're going to bring those wells back into production. You have to have a certain price if you're going to get more exploration, either domestically within the continental limits or on the offshore areas. Now, on the other hand, we can't roll back foreign crude. That doesn't belong to us, and we need it. So we've got to take it at their price. Now, hopefully, if we get the oil embargo lifted, if we get a break in that regard, then I think you can look at a price considerably less than $17, $18 a barrel, which is the overseas price of crude oil. To answer you again very quickly, domestic prices can be rolled back to a reasonable level, and hopefully I think that'll take place.
Mr. Vice President, what about the general matter of wage and price controls? They expire, the authority expires the end of April. Do you see any usefulness in keeping it in existence beyond that?
I think the President ought to ask for standby authority, but in the meantime, between now and April 30th, he ought to, through the agency, John Dunlap, continue the gradual release of certain commodities or industries or segments of our industry from the impact of wage and price controls. Perhaps by April 30th, the President won't have to actually use any.
Has the President decided to ask for a continuation of the standby authority?
I don't think he's made up his mind. We had a very important meeting on this last week one day, and there was no consensus among the members of the House and Senate who were there. I hope he asks for it. I hope Congress gives him the authority, but I hope he doesn't have to use it.
Now,
Vice President.
Excuse me, just follow on one thing. Some people think the President may have opened a credibility gap for himself by promising there be no recession this year. Is that a pledge that you really think the administration can make?
I think it's a fair promise, because the budget that the President will submit tomorrow is expansionary to take care of any contingencies in case we have any steeply rising unemployment. At the same time, it's a budget that gives the authority to attack and to continue to attack the problems of inflation.
Mr. Vice President, I'd like to take you back to the State of the Union message, and I am told that there was a secret message passed during that from Russian Ambassador Dobrynin to you. Could you tell us what that's all about?
Well, about that time, the Speaker and I got a message from our counterparts in the Soviet Union suggesting that in order to broaden the relationship between the two countries, the Soviet Union and ourselves, that there be an exchange on a regular basis of legislators or parliamentarians. I got that message, and the Speaker got it, I think, the day after, the day of the State of the Union. I think it's a good idea. It's good to have the heads of state discussing and working on mutual problems, but I think it would be a good idea if we added parliamentarians or members of Congress.
What is the next step in this proposal?
Well, the message or the letter has been sent by me to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs by the Speaker, I assume, and if the Congress approves, I think we can have these annual meetings between parliamentarians and congressmen. I think it'd be a good step forward.
Mr. Ford, are you having your papers as Vice President collected in preparation for having them assessed to give them to the government?
In 1962, I made a decision to give mine to the University of Michigan. They weren't worth very much at that time. I've given them periodically, and I've never taken any tax deduction. I'm meeting with the archivist for the University of Michigan tomorrow. We're going to discuss what they want. Maybe they want more now than they had before, but as far as I'm concerned, I've never taken a tax deduction.
Would you like to make a quick prediction on the first special election of the year coming up Tuesday in Pennsylvania? I think you campaigned for the Republican there.
I did. It's going to be very close. I don't think it's as significant as some people suggest.
On that point, Mr. Vice President, thank you very much for being with us today on Face the Nation, and we'll have a word about next week's guest in a moment.
Today on Face the Nation, Vice President Gerald Ford was interviewed by CBS News correspondent Phil Jones. David S. Broder of the Washington Post, and CBS News correspondent George Herman.